I don't sleep with my window open anymore. No matter how hot outside it gets, that bastard stays closed. It's been this way for a long time, since I was very young. Never real hit with the ladies during the summertime, but people usually recommend air conditioners, and I usually go with the prospect when I have company. But when it's in, I don't sleep well at all, because I can only imagine how easy it would be for anyone to bypass them. There is a single perk to the AC, though, besides the relief of the hot stickiness of the summer's humidity, and that's the steady hum that stifles the silence. I don't like silence, you see. There was a time when it brought me an almost zen-like level of peace and tranquility, but now I find it invasive, dangerous. Silence never comes alone. From time to time I can still hear the chanting. From my youth I can hear them all, wordlessly and yet with prodigious synchronicity and harmony with one another. Their conjoined voices echo out from the woods like the gentle and yet threatening breeze that precedes a violent hailstorm. Rhythmic yet senseless. It never went away, and yet I know they've all moved on or died. I know this all very well. When I was 9 years old, my dad and I lived in this old rented two-family apartment house in a town called Bridgewater in the state of Massachusetts. We lived on the bottom floor. The second floor wasn't used. It was recently vacated by its prior residents. It was a very quiet neighborhood, very suburban, and with plenty of woods. Behind our house, there was a backyard that proceeded into a large forest that spanned for miles out. I used to play within them. My mom and dad were recently divorced, so there was just the three of us living there, me, him, and the dog Cash, who was named after the late country singer Johnny Cash. He was an old Scottish terrier. You know the type, ankle biters with the really ugly bearded faces. They got him as a pup when I was still in diapers, and he was my lifelong friend. He may have been something of a riot, but at the time he was all I had. I cried and cried when Mom tried to take him. In the end, he was left in my father's care for my sake. Cash and I would spend a lot of time playing in the woods. When you're young, your imagination is a very powerful thing, and the woods had an almost magic quality in terms of supplementation for our imagination. I would play army, build forts, climb trees. One time, me and Cash traveled in so far I actually got lost. We were losing daylight as it was October and the light was fading at a much faster rate. I began to panic, afraid I'd be trapped out in the pitch black as we walked around, frantic for landmarks, anything familiar. That's when I saw it, the clearing with a large rock in the center. It wasn't exactly uncommon to see graffiti and vandalism in the woods. The public forest is known quite well for the trees with messages carved into them. Names, swastikas, Brad and Jen forever, and nice cute heart. Stuff like that, not to mention the pseudo gang names spray painted on rocks. That was the hangout I got of this place, a hangout for older kids. But something wasn't right. Me being only 9, my mind wasn't exactly capable of comprehending the connotations of symbols and other things, and yet there was something really off about these images. I've never seen anything like them before. The surrounding trees and crudely shaped images of, of what appeared to be a goat-man hybrid, with a stick figure, like a stick figure with an unnecessarily detailed goat's head imposed over where you expect to see a very basic stick figure face. The images were drawn over and over and over again all over the trees that surrounded the clearing, obsessively so, and not just at the basic human height level, but all the way up the trees as if whoever carved them had to use a ladder. The rock itself had red markings all over it, letters that I had never seen before. Underneath, though, was spray painted in black spray paint a message I actually could read. It said, "Behold the wisdom of the horned," and below that there were 5 painted lines. They were all the same height except for the 2 lower lines that were twice the height and spiraled outwards at the top. What really scared me about this place, though, were the dolls. They were hanging from the branches around the clearing. They appeared to be they appeared to have been woven out of sticks, and poorly so. Taking a closer look, I realized what was so scary about them. While the sticks and dolls were clearly constructed with the grace of shitty arts and crafts students, the heads of them were dry and clean skulls of animals. I don't know what of, but they were bleached white, dry and clean, in their hollow sockets. I can't explain it effectively without sounding insane, but there was something sentient about them, watchful and pleading. I could feel their eyes on me, though they had none to watch with. I felt fear, not my own fear, mind you, but something, an aura of emotion that made absolutely no sense. Have you ever been an underage drinking party that got crashed by the police? It's that kind of fear, the fear that comes synonymously with trouble. I can't explain why I did it, but I reached up and touched one. Maybe it was a child's general inquisitive nature that compelled me. Maybe it was fascination or an intense desire to quell my fear and convince myself that they were just dolls and not the watchful spirits I would eventually come to believe they were. When I touched it, the skull fell off. The doll unwound itself. Only a piece of it remained to attach the rawhide rope that it was suspended from. The skull cracked when it hit the ground. When it happened, there was a certainty that quelled within inside me. As naive as a 9-year-old could be, there was also a certainty that remained with me to this day. I don't belong here. Cash immediately started barking when the doll fell, and it startled me so effectively that I let out a scream. I looked up. The darkness was glowing red. The sky was glowing red with the darkness not too far behind. The sun was going down, and I had to get out of there. Cash was staring at me, black eyes wide open and tail wagging violently. He was barking at me insistently. He began to growl at something. Maybe air, maybe ghosts. When I approached him, he turned and ran. Cash was my only companion in this unnatural place, and I would have been damned if I was going to let him betray me to solitude here, so I gave chase. I ran for my life. The last thing I saw before I chased Cash was something that really messed with me. All the other dolls that were hanging when I first arrived, they were dangling, some even spinning lazily in the breeze. And yet, as I ran after Cash, I saw every single doll on the site were completely stationary, staring and facing me directly. I was dismissive of this detail as I was more afraid of being alone. I never let Cash out of my sight. He led me straight home. I have never loved my dog more than when I realized what he had done for me. Dogs are always lost. They always know the way. Before I went to bed, I told my dad what I saw. He laughed it off and told me it was just teenagers being punks, and that I should let it go. I found it comforting. I found it comforting. And I was almost willing to let it go. I even fell asleep without any trouble. That night was when I heard it for the first time. The noise that come to haunt me to this very day. I woke up and could hear noise coming through my window. I got up and looked out to listen closer. That's when I realized it was chanting. Voices, dozens maybe. They were coming from in the woods. I could hear them, loud and rhythmically. I don't know what they were saying, but I could tell it was ceremonious, like a hymn you hear people sing in churches. Except it felt dark, violent even. I immediately thought about the clearing with the rock, the dolls, the fear. I knew in my bones the chanting was coming from there. What scared me what scared me the most was that it wasn't far. It wasn't far at all. The chanting went on for hours. I just lied there in bed, wide-eyed with fear, listening to it, praying that it'd stop. It wouldn't, though. It went on till 4 in the morning when the early birds began to wake up. I stopped playing in the woods. My dad noticed the behavior immediately and asked if I was all right. I told him about the chanting, and again he shrugged his shoulders and said that it was probably teenagers drinking beer and having a party. I asked him why they drink beer and chant the same sound for 5 hours. He told me they weren't chanting, that I imagined it, and that I should close the window from now on. I probably should have listened to him, but I didn't. Curiosity got the better of me. The next night the chanting began again at exactly 11 o'clock. It seemed louder than before. I couldn't sleep hearing it, but I couldn't bring myself to close the window. I didn't know why I thought this way, probably because I was just a child. I dim-wittedly thought at the time that if I closed my window I wouldn't be able to hear them coming if they decided to break into the house. The logic is flawed, I know, that they would still be chanting as they emerged from the woods and crossed my yard and not be nice and quiet about it. But that's how I thought back then. That's why I couldn't close the window, because I had to know if they were coming. This went on for several days, every night from 11 to 4, exactly on the dot. Sometimes I could see in the woods, way, way, way out there, a faint glow, like the light of a fire. But it was so faint and far in between that I didn't know whether to acknowledge it or dismiss it as a trick of my own eyes. Other times I would successfully fall asleep due to exhaustion, only to wake up several hours later in panic, still able to hear it. I asked my dad if Cash could sleep in my room on the third night, and he said it'd be fine. It felt better. It felt better. It felt better knowing I had a dog to keep me company while I would hear the noise. And better yet, if I could hear them coming, he too, he would too, and then be a dog about and start barking out the window at them. I anticipated a good night's sleep and even felt silly for not thinking about the solution earlier. I fell asleep at 8 with Cash sleeping at the foot of the bed. I woke at 11:15 to Cash barking. He was on his two hind legs, tail wagging spastically, and he was barking out the window, ears pointing up, barking, growling, howling out the window. I immediately got out of bed and looked out the window towards the woods. Nothing. Nothing at all. Cash was very agitated, growling and looking at me, and then back out the window and growling and barking. The chanting was still going on, same as the last couple days. I remember feeling uncomfortable that Cash was barking at the noise, that if he was in danger of getting their attention. I tried to calm him down. That's when my dad came in. He stumbled in groggily and picked up the dog and tried to walk out the door with him, mumbling about him shutting the hell up. I called his name, but he was so asleep he was practically dead on his feet. I screamed at him, "Dad, the woods!" That got his attention. He turned around and walked up to me, looked out the window and then back at me. "This again?" he mumbled. "Look, boy, it's just your imagination." "No, listen, that's what Cash was going crazy about. There are people singing in the woods. Just listen." He looked carefully out the window. Cash was growling in his arms as his head turned out the window. I listened too, but there was nothing. No sound. Total silence. I couldn't believe it. Could this have been a coincidence? My dad told me to go to sleep and left the room, mumbling insults at Cash. The silence chilled me far more than their chanting did. At least when they were singing their malicious hymns, there was at least a sense of distance between them and me. But I know, but right now, I know they're out there, but I don't know where. I had no bearings whatsoever. What was even worse was what wrought unprecedented terror upon me was that there was no nighttime ambience in those woods, no crickets. Evenings brought them out in droves this time of year, and even when they were chanting, I could still hear them. But now it was quieter than a bone-chilling winter night. Pure silence. How long, how long did I stare out those windows at the woods across my yard? I have no idea. When I woke up the next day, I was still sitting in the chair I planted right by it. That morning over breakfast, I insisted that there really was chanting out there, but my dad wasn't hearing any of it. He put his foot down and told me that he won't hear any more of this, that I need to grow up and take responsibility and stop being so afraid all the time. You know, typical tough guy dad shit. I didn't even bother to bring up the lack of crickets, knowing full well that he'd have made up an explanation for that as well. So I kept so I kept so I kept quiet and ate my breakfast. Later that day, I was waiting for my mom to pick me up at the end of my dad's driveway to bring me to my grandma's house where she was currently living. It was Friday, and my mom had me on weekends. As I was waiting, a large black pickup truck was passed by the house very slowly. It came to a stop right in front of me. There were two men in the truck, older, about my dad's age. At first I thought maybe they were friends of his, but this thought didn't last. The driver rolled down his window and looked at me. He was bald and wearing abnormally slim sunglasses. He was smoking a thin cigar, or cigarillo. I remembered the strong smell of it. He looked at me as if he were sizing me up, investigating for a moment, until finally he smiled at me, reached over and hit his friend on the shoulder, and pointed me out to him. He too was bald and wearing the same sunglasses. They said something to each other, and then the driver looked back at me with a terrible smile. smile, and drove away, waving slowly at me as he did so. They passed me by 3 more times before my mom finally picked me up. I didn't give those two any more thought, just took comfort in the thought that I'd be sleeping somewhere else for the next couple of nights. The weekend went by without a hitch, and sleeping over at Grandma's house was such a relief. When I told her and Mom about the voices in the woods, they just looked at each other and told me to tell Dad about it. Frustrated, I argued that it did, but it was pointless. She too used the "it's just your imagination" crap, same as Dad. Not once during the whole experience did the memory leave my mind of the 2 men in the truck or the distant chanting. Soon enough, I would have to return. Saturday night came along, and I was dragged back off at my dropped back off at my dad's house, where I would spend the whole day dreading the inevitable nightfall, dreading the answer of whether or not I would hear the chanting in the woods, hear the strange people sing their dark silent songs in unison. I begged my dad to let me keep Cash in the room with me tonight, but he said no, leaving me to face whatever happened next alone. So come bedtime, I was sitting on my chair by the window, staring into the darkness until the hour came. I stayed up until 11, expecting to hear it, but what I got was silence. No singing, no crickets either. Just pure silence. I couldn't tell if I was relieved or terrified. Maybe they all moved on. Maybe they went somewhere else to play their creepy games. It took some self-convincing, but I finally managed to calm myself to such a state of mind where I could actually go to sleep knowing I was safe. Reluctantly, I crawled into bed and closed my eyes. I woke up to the most bone-chillingly fucked up thing I had ever seen. It was surreal. The fucking image of it every time I sleep. My brain immediately surged itself into full function beyond consciousness and straight into full-fledged fight-or-flight mode as a cold, rough hand forced its way over my mouth and shoved my face in my own mattress. I felt a body much larger than mine bear down at me. I felt the jagged kneecap ram itself directly into my stomach as I was pulled out of my bed and wrestled into a standing position. The cold hand still holding my mouth shut, another hand wedging my left hand behind my back and pulling upwards until the pain became so unbearable I thought my arm was going to come off. "Shh," a voice whispered in my ear. His breath was ice cold. "Yes," said another voice across the room. My eyes were well adjusted to the darkness as it was, and I could see through the moonlight shining into my now opened window a man wearing a horrible, horrible mask. At first I thought he had the head of a goat, but I knew better. The goat stared with lifeless marbles where its eyes should have been. Its head was a mask made out of the severed head of a goat or a ram, not properly stuffed and half rotten. Its horns curled into spirals jutting out of its head, and random patches of the fur were missing, simply to show raw, blistering skin. I tried to scream, but the hand over my mouth tightened its grip. My arm behind my back pulled to near breaking point. "Scream and we kill you," the voice whispered in my ear. My eyes couldn't. No, they wouldn't break away from that horrible person wearing the severed goat's head as a mask. He was shirtless, wearing a necklace of what appeared to be bones. He was horribly emaciated, and there were markings all up and down his torso. In his right hand he held a knife about the size of my forearm. Its build wasn't like any knife I had ever seen. It took a step closer to me and pressed it up against my throat. The steel was bitterly cold, and the tip of the knife was sharper than anything I ever felt. It wouldn't take less than 4 ounces of pressure to cut my throat with it, and they knew I knew it. I couldn't cry. I couldn't even breathe. In its other hand it held a basic candle. "Tomorrow," the thing said, his voice muffled by the lifeless, dead goat mask, "you will exit your house at midnight. You will light this candle, place it on the ground in the center of your yard, and you will sit behind it, legs crossed, right foot on top of your left knee, and vice versa. If you don't do this," the voice whispered in my ear, "the blood of your loved ones will be on your hands." The goat man quickly retreated the blade from my neck. I don't remember what happened next. I remember waking up the next night, panting and crying. My dad came in to see what was wrong with me, And when I told him, he told me it was a nightmare. At that point, he sat down at the end of the bed. He looked very wary, like he didn't want to say what he was going to say. He rubbed his eyes with his fist and weirdly explained to me that this was me, just me, all this was just me stressing out over the divorce, that maybe we should start looking into a therapist about these voices and hallucinations I've been having. I remember feeling so betrayed, so alone in the unfairness of that. I argued with him that everything I was seeing and hearing was true, but it was too late. He and my mother, he and my mother talked it out. My behavior, my claims, they think I was losing my shit over the divorce. Their minds were made up. Nothing I was going to say would have convinced them otherwise. And of course, in hindsight, it only made perfect sense. Who would believe a 9-year-old when they say that there were voices? I was silent the whole day. Cash sat with me in my room as I wasted the daylight playing video games. I didn't speak to my old man, not once. I could see the wary looks on his face when he walked by my room, but he didn't want to press the issue. He looked just as defeated as I did. He spent most of his time on the phone. It wasn't until later day that I found myself recalling what the goat thing said to me before everything went dark. That I had to light a candle at midnight. When I woke up that morning, there was nothing in my room. There was a sudden sense of hope because when I searched around the room trying to find the candle, it was nowhere to be found. Never, even to this day, have I searched so hard for something only to be frantically pleased by the end results. It was gone. Had I been alleviated from the duties imposed on me by these strange interlopers? The relief was unbelievable, like I was severed from horrible burden, even though the thought of being forced to see a shrink didn't seem so harsh compared to the prospect that maybe these attackers really were just a bad dream. A severely realistic dream, mind you, but a dream nonetheless. Maybe the whole situation really was over. Maybe these horrible people did move on, and that the goat man was simply a mental projection of my own imagination, matched with expectation towards what it was, toward, towards whatever it was that those unnatural proceedings just beyond my sight were. You know, speculation. Nightfall came, and for the first time in a week I felt no fear at the prospect of it. That felt good, like things were going back to normal. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. When I placed my head on my pillow, eyes already closing, consciousness already drifting away, I felt a lump under my pillow. Curiously, I reached down and felt something. Something long and smooth. I put out a candle. A tall, thin wax candle with a nice long wick. It was red, just like the one that the goat man was holding. My heart sank, my mouth went dry, and tears ran down my cheeks. And in that moment I relived the entirety of last night all over, down to the very last detail where the guy holding me whispered in my ear how the blood of my loved ones would be on my hand. Suddenly I was back in hell. I was back in the realm of terror. How did they get the candle under my pillow? Had I overlooked it this whole time? I lay in bed until midnight. I didn't dare close my eyes for fear of being held at knife point again, for fear of coming face to face with that horrible goat creature. The night was silent, no crickets, no birds, nothing. Dead silence. I could see that it had turned 12:01. The memory of the mask in my mind uttering its instructions to me over and over. Go outside, light the candle, sit behind it, do it, or the blood of my loved ones will be on my hands. At the time, I didn't know what it meant to have blood on your hands. The following day, I would learn exactly what it meant. Around 10 minutes in, I mustered up the courage to walk over to my window and look out. What I saw choked me up on the spot. Side by side at the entrance of the wood, I saw men, shadowed by the night, standing side by side. There must have been 20 of them. None of them were saying anything. They were all just dead silent, and I could feel their eyes on me. It was just as strong as when I felt the eyes of the dolls on me back at their sight. In a way, they felt like the same presence, the same intelligence. I can't explain. I can't explain, and then I saw him, the goat man, or rather the silhouette of him standing in the center of the figures. He was still, still as stone, but I could make out the face shape, the jutting horns. I could make it all out. I chickened out. I couldn't go out there. I just couldn't. I hid in my blankets. I hid in my bed, blankets over my head, and I shut my eyes tight, crying all night. I didn't fall asleep until I heard the early morning birds. I was awake by 11:30. Shortly after breakfast, I heard my dad shouting in the front yard. I went I went out to check and see what was happening, what it was that had him so upset. As I went out the front door, I could hear him more clearly. I could hear pain in his voice. A knot formed in my throat, and a harrowing sensation crawled across my skin. I was not ready to learn about the events that transpired, and that was truly the scariest part, the moment before actualization. These people have mentioned blood on my hands. I didn't know what it meant, but I had a very vague idea that it meant my family getting hurt. I thought they got my dad. When I got to him, I saw he was on his knees, crying. Cash was killed. He was hit by a car. There he lay, goofy pointed ears, his absurdly silly dog beard, black staring eyes, and hanging tongue, stationary, forever. I saw that his center torso had collapsed, and I could see openings in his rear side, his ribs jutting out, his entrails. Son, my dad cried out as he turned to hug me. It's okay. He quickly led me back into the house, away from Cash's lifeless body, away from my best friend, dead and mutilated on the side of the road. The last thing I remember seeing as I was brought into the house was a large pickup truck driving by slowly. I saw the same two bald men, as old as my dad, staring at me through oddly slim sunglasses. I saw blood on their front right tire, and I saw the driver point directly at me. Cash's death was my fault. As I said it out loud, my dad held me tight and said with stone cold certainty that it wasn't my fault. That sometimes these things happen. He told me exactly what you would expect a father to tell his kid when their pet is killed in a random and seemingly pointless accident. But I knew better. The people in the woods killed Cash, and it was all because I didn't do what they said. It was because I was a coward. His blood was on my hands, just as they said it would be. When I went into my room to cry, I saw outside my window a man in the center of the backyard, a man with no shirt on. He was wearing a mask made of severed goat's head, hollowed out on the inside. In the daylight, it was far more disturbing to see, because I could almost smell the lack of sanitation it had to have exerted. I could see that it was surrounded by flies, and even worse than that, I saw a note it was holding up, a piece of paper with a single word written across it. Midnight.